Hello, and welcome to the Afterschool Alliance's first Policy Pulse of 2026. I want to wish you all a rewarding year ahead. I am Erik Peterson, Senior Vice President for Policy for the Afterschool Alliance. And for the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to talk through what the new year may bring from an after-school policy perspective, and then followed by the status of the fiscal year 2026 appropriations. And then we're going to talk through two challenges that came up in the last few weeks impacting existing federal supports for out-of-school time programs. And then finally, follow up with a few other items that are on our radar that may be of interest. And then finally, take questions from you all from the chat. So again, if you had questions that you put in the registration form, that's great. Or again, we should have an opportunity to answer a few questions from the chat. I also want to thank, before we get started, my After School Alliance colleagues, Lucy and Sean and Ursula, who are helping run the show today, and then also Stephen, our policy fellow, who's going to be helping out in the chat, answering and organizing some questions as well. So again, looking forward to working with you all in 2026, and we'll go ahead and jump into the agenda. So what do we expect in 2026? Safe to say there'll be additional challenges, particularly from the administration in terms of ongoing efforts to dismantle the Department of Education. We're entering the year with at least two challenges already on existing funding, which we'll go into here shortly on the agenda. But we also anticipate there could be additional ones throughout the year, similar to what we saw last year with the funding pauses on things like the AmeriCorps grants, as well as farm to school grants early in the year. And then, of course, the withholding of 21st Century Community Learning Center funds in July, along with four other federal education funding streams. Hoping that we don't see more of that, but it's certainly something to be prepared for. Also expected this year is continued federal funding challenges, but also opportunities through the annual appropriations process. So first, we have to finish up the fiscal year 26 process, which we'll get into shortly, and status of that. Hopefully, that'll get done here early in the year, and then the fiscal year 2027 appropriations process should kick off here in the next couple months as well. That normally starts with a budget proposal from the administration that'll likely come probably late February or March. And that's expected to echo a lot of the themes we saw in the president's fiscal year 26 proposal, so proposed cuts and reorganization as well. There will also, however, with that fiscal year 27 appropriations process, be opportunities to reach out to Congress to sign on and support on letters of support for funding streams for after school and summer, as well as to weigh in through meetings in person and otherwise with your members of Congress. So that's all to come this year. We have already entered now the second session of the 119th Congress that kicked off earlier this week. As we know, all sessions of Congress have a first and second two sessions. Potentially dominating this year will be midterm elections in November. I think the effect of that could be, and we're already seeing that actually this week, increased congressional activity and action, early on in the year, but then that could slow down. Typically in a midterm election year, we see that slow down as we get closer to election day, and the atmosphere on the Hill gets even more political and more partisan, leading up to the November elections. That said, this week has seen a flurry of congressional activity, including addressing some issues that Congress have needed to take up really for years. And that, I think, bodes well in terms of making progress on things like, the spending bills. Typically in a midterm election year, Congress is out for some time in October to allow members to campaign. So that also sort of shortens the calendar as well in terms of getting things done for Congress. At the state level for 2026, we expect, also funding challenges and opportunities. A lot of states are starting new legislative sessions this month. Some of those will be short, some will last but then others will last into summer and fall. The momentum of the last few years in seeing really significant increases in the number of states and also the amount of state level funding for after school and summer. Hopefully that will continue, although it wouldn't surprise me if we see that slow a little bit this year. States are really struggling. A number of states are struggling, not all, with balancing their budget. And, we saw that last year with two states actually three states, that were significantly delayed in getting their state budgets done. Also, there's changes at the federal level, to Medicaid and to tax code that were passed, as part of federal legislation last year, HR 1. And that, as states sort of untangle that could be, potentially major funding losses and budget shortfalls at the state level where, some of those gaps, in federal funding will have to be covered. So, will be another interesting year at the state level. All that said, already this week we continue to see signs that governors and legislators of both parties, and really a wide variety of states, view investments in after school and summer as critical to supporting students and families. And, already a couple of, state of the state sort of governors' addresses, have talked about the importance of funding after school and summer. We saw that in Vermont, just the other day as well. Again, finally, thinking through what's ahead, even though it's a cliche, we can say that, we should expect the unexpected. There will be surprises again this year and challenges that we'll need to confront as a field. But also, I think it's fair to say, more than fair to say, that we expect after school and summer programs, staff, leaders, intermediaries, networks, supporters, all of us to really rise up again and meet those challenges and overcome them. We're all, resilient field. We're passionate about giving young people the opportunities they need to survive and succeed, to thrive and succeed. And so we'll, all continue to work together to seize those opportunities, address those challenges, and continue on. And really do look forward again working with all of you, on those challenges, but also, on seizing those opportunities, in the year ahead. Okay, and speaking of overcoming challenges, let's talk about fiscal year 2026 appropriations. Move into that sort of second bullet on the agenda. The promising news first, a package of three fiscal year 26 spending bills, passed the House of Representatives yesterday with a really strong bipartisan vote, 397 to 28. So that, if you're keeping track of fiscal year 26 spending, obviously the fiscal year began October 1st. It ends September 30th, October 1st of last year, ends September 30th of this year, 2026. Three of the 12 individual spending bills passed as part of that continuing resolution that passed after the shutdown back in November. That continuing resolution goes through January 30th. And so the race is on really to get those remaining 9 individual spending bills done. This is a good sign this week with the House passing 3 more. The Senate will likely take up that package with 3 spending bills, next week. Then there'll be another package with 3 more spending bills. And then finally, we anticipate at the end of the month, hopefully, the final, sort of minibus, what we call them, because it's smaller than an omnibus spending bill, but the final package, which will then likely have the labor HHS education spending bill, along with transportation and HUD and defense. So, still more to come on that. That said, let's talk a little bit about this bill that passed the House yesterday by this big margin. It does include, again, 3 bills, including the Commerce, Justice, Science Appropriations Bill. That bill funds STEM education and mentoring, also has a number of earmarks for local programs, although, earmarks were a point of contention, and we may see some challenges in the Senate with some of those, earmarks on some of these bills. That 3 bill package, with Commerce, Justice, Science has 105 million for youth mentoring, programs. That's up 1 million from the fiscal year 25, appropriation for mentoring. It also has 938 million for National Science Foundation education and training programs. Those funds actually are proposed to be cut, in the president's, proposed budget for fiscal year 26. So another, example of advocacy and the support in Congress for informal STEM education and science education. My colleague Leslie Brooks on our team has a great blog up on the STEM funding pieces, included in the Commerce, Justice, Science bill, and we'll drop that, in the chat to take a look at. So, going back though to the Labor, Health, and Human Services Education Bill, that is the one that includes 21st Century Community Learning Centers. It includes Child Care Development Block Grant, Title I, education funds, which could be used for after school. AmeriCorps is in there. So there's a lot of, and also the Department of Labor programs, around youth workforce development. So a lot of focus on that bill. It's now looking at, like I said, that'll be paired with the defense spending bill and the Transportation, Housing, Urban Development, or THUD, bill. And that'll likely be the last of the 4 spending bill packages. There continue to be concerns, really about all of these, but about that package too, with some of the earmark issues. The House does not have earmarks in the Labor HHS bill. The Senate does, like figuring that out. And then there was agreement, between the House and the Senate appropriation leadership back in December. Also, while some folks were on break, that set top line funding levels that are below fiscal year 25 levels, so that could create additional pressure to cut spending somewhere. Again, we saw some, but not a lot of cuts in the bill that passed the House yesterday. So also note that House and Senate appropriators are working on that labor HHS education bill now, determining funding levels for programs, as well as, talking about possible language that might limit the move of programs from the Department of Education to other agencies like the Department of Labor. So that's at least being discussed at this point as House and Senate Republicans and Democrats sort of negotiate that bill package. Just as a reminder, 21st Century Community Learning Center, Child Care Development Block Grant, Title I, AmeriCorps, all those funds, that are really key to supporting local after-school and summer programs. Those were all either maintained or increased in the Senate Labor HHS education spending bill that passed Appropriations Committee back in July. And, hearing good signs that a lot of those, hopefully all those program funding levels that were pretty good and solid in that Senate bill will also be reflected at those same levels in the final negotiated bipartisan fiscal year 26 labor HHS education bill that they're working on now. No guarantees, but things are, at least right now, are looking okay. Bottom line on fiscal year 26 appropriations. So we're about 21 days or so, if I do my math right, from the January 30th continuing resolution deadline. Again, seeing some good momentum and progress towards getting all those 12 spending bills done, with 3 already done, 3 more that passed the House heading to the Senate. But there's also a lot of, as I mentioned, potential stumbling blocks that could derail the process. The House and Senate are also scheduled to be out for some time. I believe one chamber is out the second to last week of the month, and then the other chamber is out the last week. So that's going to compound sort of the schedule and make things challenging. As a reminder, any of the appropriation bills, so those remaining 9 that are not signed into law by January 30th, would likely have to have another short-term continuing resolution to buy more time to get those done. As a last resort, there are still some folks saying that we could possibly have a full year continuing resolution for fiscal year 26, like we saw with 25. But again, a lot of folks are trying really hard to avoid that and to actually have a real fiscal year 26 spending bill for all 12 bills, including labor HHS education. I will say it does appear that there's pretty strong consensus about avoiding another shutdown. Of course, anything can happen, anything can change, but that's a really good sign because that would not be a good way to start the year. And also, it's a good time today and through the end of the month with appropriation staff, working on finalizing that bill now. It's a good time to weigh in with Congress about the need to support after-school and summer programs. There's a link in the chat there to help you with that as well. An alert to take a moment to send a note to your members of Congress about the importance of investing in after-school and summer. All right. Going to go on now to the third bullet, which is new administration challenges to existing after-school funding supports. Several hours after our December policy pulse back the second week in December, the Department of Education notified about around a dozen organizations that are grantees of the Full Service Community Schools Grant Program through the Federal Department of Education that their funding would not be continued after December 31st. So Full Service Community Grants, for those not familiar, this is a discretionary grant program at the Department of Ed that's been around for quite some time. These are typically 5-year grants. They typically go to school districts or state level or local level, nonprofit and other organizations to help with coordination and infrastructure around developing community schools or supporting existing community schools. Super important from an out-of-school time perspective. A very strong component of all community schools is out-of-school time, is after-school and summer programs, typically before school as well. It also has other wraparound supports and services, and really a strong, solid model for helping involve community in schools and helping support students and the community as a whole. So that was extremely bad news to hear in December. The non-continuation notices did include an opportunity to appeal the decision within 7 days. A number of the grantees, I think possibly all of them, filed an appeal. at least one grantee in Idaho, the community school grant appeal was denied. Then the next day, the funding was reinstated. So far, that's the only one we know of that where the funding is being reinstated. That happened in late December. Other grantees in other states have seen their funding terminated. Again, not all full service community schools grantees. Some were not impacted by those letters in December. There are multiple lawsuits now challenging the termination of funding, two lawsuits in Illinois, and then one with the attorney generals in North Carolina, Washington, D.C., and Maryland. Um, but again, because of the importance of these funds and the impact they have on local communities and schools, it's something we're watching closely, and a number of folks are helping support and working on the after school and summer piece of this. In addition to the impact on the communities, is devastating. We do have a blog on this that we had an update on this week that we'll drop in the chat. And again, it's something we're continuing to see. This is another example where weighing in with members of Congress about what, just informing folks what these funds do and the impact they have and the importance of them, continues to be critical. Similarly, last week, the Department of Health and Human Services, so a different agency, not education, announced a freeze on federal child care and development funds. Initially, that was announced through social media last week of last year around all 50 states being impacted. As a reminder, Child Care Development Fund, also known similar to the Child Care Development Block Grant, pretty much use those interchangeably. They serve more than 1 million children ages 0 to 13 nationwide. 44% of the children served in that program are actually school age, so between the ages of 5 and 13. A number of after school programs are able to leverage those vouchers that parents get through CCDF. It's since been clarified that 50 state freeze on funding will actually, for most states, be additional requirements so that the funds will flow, but that there'll be additional requirements the state will have to provide in terms of guaranteeing that there's no fraud in the system and confirming how the funds are being spent. That potentially could cause delays, but also it's encouraging news that those funds appear to be flowing from what we've heard from state agencies involved there. But again, this is another, and I'll plug this later, but a request for please, reach out to us if we can be helpful or if there is information that you're hearing or seeing or delays in funding some of these funding streams. Additionally, then, so that was sort of the 50 state freeze. Additionally, earlier this week, 5 states, Minnesota, California, Colorado, Illinois, and New York, were notified by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services that they're not just child care grant funding, but also temporary assistance for needy families, or TANF, and social service block grant funds would all be frozen. That's about just about 7.4 billion in funding for temporary assistance for needy families across those states, just under 2.5 billion in childcare funding, about 870 million in social service block grant funding. All of those grant programs actually do support after school programs to varying degrees. And we've talked about the importance of childcare funding to support after school programs, but TANF in a number, not all, but in a number of states uses those funds to support both school age after school and school age care, but also TANF funds can be used to support adolescent programs, after school programs in a number of states, and social service block grant too, less so, but there's a number of examples where those funds have been used for after school too. So this is something we're watching closely. Those 5 states involved that I mentioned filed a lawsuit yesterday in the U.S. District Court in Southern District of New York, challenging the freeze in funds. The Department of Health and Human Services has suggested that this is a review for compliance and that the funds would be restored once potentially once the compliance review is completed. It continues to be something that we're monitoring closely. Jillian and our team is sort of lead for childcare, and we'll continue to follow that. If you are experiencing funding delays, though, or challenges with these or other funding streams, please reach out. It helps us to sort of make the case when we have examples of what exactly is going on at the local level with these. But 2 instances, and there's others, but 2 instances we want to flag that directly relate, with the community schools and childcare and TANF funds that are hopefully will get resolved here early in the year, but not a good way to start the year. Want to get to the last bullet here, which is a kind of a catch-all, if you will, grab bag, potpourri of additional items on our radar that I thought was important to flag. And then we'll jump to questions in the chat as well. Oh, I did see a question about, did happen to see in the chat. It's hard for me to multitask, but about which states. So I will cover that. That was Minnesota, California, Colorado, Illinois, and New York were the five that were saw their funding frozen, but also that are involved in the lawsuit now. So there's additional items on the radar. This year's State of the Union address, where the president will address a joint session of Congress, will be held on February 24th, a little later than usual. We expect then, because of that, that the president's fiscal year 2027 budget proposal, where he sort of lays out the blueprint of what he thinks the administration thinks funding should be spent on. We expect that now to come out around then or shortly thereafter, late February, early March. Again, hard to know exactly what will be in that, but I think looking at last year's will be a good indication. So it'll be another opportunity to weigh in with Congress about the importance of funding after school and summer if there are cuts to programs proposed in that budget proposal. Also wanted to flag that earlier this week on Wednesday, the Department of Education approved the first elementary and secondary education waiver under this administration. It was requested by Iowa. A couple other states, including Indiana and others, have also requested similar waivers, but this was the first one to actually be approved. Iowa's waiver allows their state Department of Education to pool all what's called state activities funds. So for those not in the weeds on 21st Century and some of these other funding streams, 21st Century Community Learning Center has allocation for every state and territory for 21st Century funds. Of those funds, 5% can be held at this, up to 5% can be held at the state level for what's called activities funds. That's typically things like evaluation of the program, professional development, hosting state conferences, technical assistance, capacity building. And then there's 2% that's used for administrative costs to actually run the program. And then the additional 93% then, that should add up to 100, are then granted through competitions, through request for proposal competitions down to the local level to community-based organizations, school districts, et cetera, to run after school and summer programs, 21st Century programs. So what the waiver does, it does not affect that 93%. It affects that 5% of state activity funds for 21st Century as well as a couple other federal education title programs. That the state now part of education now in Iowa can pool those funds together and use them where sort of with flexibility to where they have needs that they want to address. Again, does not impact the funds at the that go down to grantees at the local level, but it will have an effect on those programs, obviously, because if those activities fees are not continued to be used for things like evaluation, technical assistance, professional development, that impacts 21st Century providers at the local level. So continue, watching that, concerned about that. The 2% administrative fees sort of always under ESEA were flexible in that they could be moved around to support other federal education programs. So that isn't necessarily impacted by this waiver. It's really those 5% activity fees. Indiana is rumored to be have their waiver request approved next. And I know a number of states are looking at this process. So it's something to be aware of. Again, for the impact that it has on sort of the capacity building evaluation and support at the state level for programs. Two other things on the items, then we'll get to questions. The first round of public comments on the tax credit scholarship program, which we spent some time talking about back in the December policy pulse. So I encourage you to go back and look at that on our YouTube channel. If you have more questions on that, we do have a couple blogs from September and from December on that program. That was authorized in HR 1. Those comments to Treasury Department helping inform the regulatory process were due on December 26th. They had somewhere around 2,200 comments that were submitted. We're reviewing those. There's been some good press coverage on what's in some of those comments. A number of statewide after-school networks, a number of allied national after-school providers like the Boys and Girls Club of America, YMCA of the USA, American Campus Association, others interested groups submitted letters, as did the After School Alliance. Our comment letter is in the blog from December. There appears to be, momentum based on the comments and on press coverage after that the comment period closed around ensuring that after school and maybe summer learning might be an eligible use for the scholarship program. Our interpretation of the law that passed does include after school as an allowable use for the scholarships. We expect sort of next steps on this, that proposed regulations from Department of Treasury will come out sometime in the coming months. It could be in this first quarter of the year or somewhere like that. And that they'll also be open for comments. That remains to be seen, but that's our understanding. As a reminder, those education tax credit scholarships go into effect for the 2027 tax year. So it's something that really is on our radar, should be on your all's radar for this year, because there'll be a lot of things that need to happen getting ready for allowing individual taxpayers to take advantage of that and potentially provide funding for scholarships for after school and summer in the 27 tax year. So flagging that, we'll have a blog up on that in the next couple of weeks as well, summarizing some of the comments and next steps there. Last thing, White House and Department of Health and Human Services, you might have seen in the press, released new dietary guidelines for Americans and a revised food pyramid earlier this week on Wednesday. Why that matters for us and for the out-of-school time field: by law, school meals and child and adult care feeding program, which includes the after-school meal program, those meal pattern requirements for those federal child nutrition programs are supposed to be consistent with and follow the dietary guidelines. So anytime there's a change, and that usually happens every 4 or 5 years, anytime there's a change to the dietary guidelines for Americans, that means potentially meal pattern requirement changes to those programs. That usually takes a couple of years for that to flow down to the regulatory level, although could happen sooner. But basically expect the U.S. Department of Agriculture to make regulatory changes to those child nutrition programs to reflect the new guidelines at some point. So flagging that. So that was a lot. Big takeaway here. Take a moment to share your support or after school with your elected officials. That handy way to do that is there on the screen. And now let's get to some questions in the time we have left. Um, I'm seeing the first question here. Oh, and Stephen answered that. Yep, the fiscal year 27 budget proposal that'll be talked about in State of the Union. Other questions that we have up here? Yep, I see Steve Fowler has an article to the lawsuit I mentioned around the funding freeze in those 5 states. And not seeing any other questions in the chat. However, if you have them, feel free to drop those in there. I will say, with the couple minutes we have, while I'm biding time for folks who might be typing, hang on, there we go. There are, a couple other things to be aware of on the childcare side. We mentioned the freezing in funds, so they're semi-unrelated to that. Earlier this week, the Department of Health and Human Services did put out a call for comments on proposed basically rescinding of the childcare rule that was finalized 2 years ago now, 2024, that did make some changes around how reimbursements flow to programs from states, and sort of the parent voucher program, what's counted in terms of enrollment versus attendance. So that's an opportunity to comment as well, and we'll have a blog up on that shortly soon. There's also, on the childcare front, a hearing in the House Education Workforce Committee next Tuesday, I believe, that will be we'll be addressing sort of current trends and policy around childcare support as well. So it's something to keep an eye on. Do you see a couple of questions in here? I'll try to get to quickly. Has there been any full service community fund reinstated? Yes. So the grantee in Idaho, which I believe was United Way, saw their funding for community schools reinstated. And then again, there were a number of full service community school grantees that were not impacted by the by the letters terminating funding that continue, including some in New York and other places. As of now, do we anticipate there'll be competitions for 21st century? It really depends on the state, but again, fingers crossed, there will be 21st century funding for fiscal year 26 approved by the end of the month, or if there's a continuing resolution shortly thereafter. So I do expect states will see that and hopefully will do grants, although there's nothing that requires a state education agency to hold the 21st century grant competition every single year. So it'll be a state decision on that. And again, for the question to Timothy, next round of funding, it depends on the state. But there we should see those this year. Last question, because I know we're out of time, from Laura, could we expect new full service community schools funding? It is in the full service community schools funding is in was appropriated for fiscal year 25. It is in the fiscal year 26 Senate Labor HHS bill. So we will see what happens when that gets finalized end of the month. But right now it's looking like it will. Thank you all again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you next month. And we'll see you on another Zoom soon.